Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us on today's panel discussion webinar, Data-Centric Security, Staying Ahead of the Threat Curve, brought to you by the ITGRC Forum. The ITGRC Forum produces educational events for the governance, risk management, and compliance community, and we provide free market intelligence to all of our members. If you're not already a member, you can register at www.executiveitforums.org. I'm Kelly Vick, the host of today's program, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We welcome back Dr. Brandon Williams as moderator for today's session. Brandon is Director of Cybersecurity at MUFG Union Bank. He has 20 years of experience in business, technology, and information security as a consultant, leader, and an executive, and he's authored 4 books on PCI compliance. His blog and other publications can be found at his website, www.brandonwilliams.com. In his spare time, you'll find him flying airplanes, chasing storms, or manning a barbecue pit. And on the panel, we have Steve Durbin, Managing Director of the Information Security Forum, Robert Shields, Director of Product Marketing for Data Security and Privacy at Informatica, and Farshad Ghazi, Global Product Management at HPE Security Data Security. We'll run through a more detailed introduction with our panel in a moment, but first I'll go over the housekeeping and the agenda. First, the webcast is streaming live, and all lines will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the conference. For maximum quality, you can click to view in full screen on the bottom right-hand side of your console. If you have any issues with the audio, please first check your device settings before contacting technical support. And we recommend that you paste our direct landing page into a fresh browser window and close any other live windows to avoid any conflicts. The direct console URLs are displayed on your screen now and clickable in the attached PDF slide deck. Next, we want to hear from you and hope to get your feedback during today's session. If you have any suggestions for future topics, please let us know. We do value feedback, and we take it into consideration when planning future events. Please submit this through the Ratings tab below your console, and please be sure to scroll down to click Submit. We'll also be taking your questions throughout today's discussion. You can submit these at any time using the question button, and if we don't manage to answer all of your questions today, we will respond by email. If you'd like a copy of the slides, you can download these through the Attachments tab, where you can also access the related white papers and resources at any time during the discussion. And finally, after the live presentation, this webcast will be available on demand, so please do share with any colleagues who you think may be interested in the topic. Moving on to the agenda, we'll begin by going over a quick introduction with each of our panelists before the roundtable discussion facilitated by Brandon. After the discussion, we'll close out with some takeaways and further information from our speakers. So now, without further ado, I'll turn the program over for today's discussion. Over to you, Brandon.
Thanks, Kelly. It's always a fantastic job setting this up. So to start, I'd like to run around the table and hear from each of our panelists. And so for each of you, as I come to you, just tell me a little bit about yourself, your organization, and so that the people listening today, either live with us right now or in the archives, can understand your frame of reference for the comments that you'll be providing today. So, Farshad, let's start with you, please.
Thanks, Brandon. Hi, my name is Farshad Ghazi. I'm the Global Product Manager for HPE Security, Data Security, and the product line I'm representing is HPE Secure Data. Very excited to be here, and thanks for your time, and hope you find it valuable. I have been in the security business for some time now, and I find data-centric security truly to be the answer for a lot of the issues we have around the breaches, around the data theft, as well as the insurmountable amount of funds and resources going into security and the breaches that are happening. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about the data security, what it is, and where we are heading. So we used to be called Voltage Security, and back in 2015, we were acquired by Hewlett-Packard and then Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. And we have been in the security group software division alongside with the ArcSight as well as Fortify. And overall, we have had a broad portfolio and set of products specifically aimed at security. So we are very happy to be alongside with those, and we have a lot of integration with those. However, we have a lot of significant banks as well as industry from all over as our customers. Many of the top banks are our customers. And as you can see in this slide, we have shown several different categories of use cases that our customers often rely on. One is compliance. Of course, we have the PCI scope reduction, very important for our customers, and GDPR, et cetera, that are coming in full force from Europe. and as well as many other regulatory and data sovereignty and data residencies coming into place. In addition, we see that privacy and de-identification is becoming quite important regardless of what kind of data you have, not just credit card, but also a very important PII and PHI. This is becoming more critical as security breaches are happening more frequently and more state actors and money is being poured into that. And finally, the cloud security and secure collaboration overall. We see a lot of use cases in which a lot of companies like to share their data with third-party analytics and BI tools and so on. Move to the AWS and Azure as well as private clouds is very critical. However, there's a concern around security and data-centric security. We feel that is one of the only viable solutions that really revolves and aims at securing the data, not anything else.
Okay, great. Thanks, Farshad. So next up, let's go to Robert. Tell us a little bit about your work, yourself and your work you're doing at Informatica.
Sure. I'm with Informatica for about 3 years now, heading up their data security efforts, very focused on data-centric security. We see this as fundamental to what organizations are doing to try to improve their breach resiliency, their privacy efforts, their compliance efforts. Anyway, I've been in the market for a long time. I've also helped introduce a number of key technologies, and I mentioned that in the context of, data-centric security is really something that, is part and parcel of a lot of security practices, but needs to be much more. And so there's a lot of evangelization and, market making going on. Informatica itself, we're all about data. And with that, we believe that the utilization of data today in all these various forms that you see on the screen need protection. And, fundamental to that, if we move to the next slide, we believe key to data-centric security is about understanding the data. Where is it? What do you have? Those type of things. Monitoring it. Who's using it? Where is it going? Those are very key questions, with the proliferation of data across so many platforms and environments. Understanding who's doing what with the data, and then remediating and, protecting risk that you find as you're analyzing and discovering data across your organization.
Thanks, Robert. And I'm looking forward to your conversation today because that seems like an easy thing to do on paper, but as people try to do it, it becomes a much larger job, and it's a really big thing to do. So thank you for that. And last but not least, let's move to Steve. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you're doing at ISF?
Hi, Brandon. Yes, hello, everybody. Steve Durbin. I'm the Managing Director of the ISF. I've been at the ISF for the last 7 years, and I think during that period, my job certainly has taken me all around the world. At the ISF, we tend to focus on security as a sort of holistic perspective. So we do cover the full range of vertical sectors, and I think that one of the things that has become very clear, certainly over the last few years, is that the need to focus very much more acutely, I think, on managing information, how it flows, where it flows. That really, I think, is going to be key to the way in which we can adopt a very much more proactive approach to security as opposed to playing a somewhat defensive game, which I think we've necessarily had to do in the past. Regarding the ISF, well, we are a 26-year-old non-profit organization, member-owned and driven, where our members tend to be large organizations, typically in the Forbes and Fortune. We do have a global coverage. The members are all the way from New Zealand right the way across to Brazil and all points in between, with certainly a large penetration of organizations across Europe and the United States. As I mentioned, we do cover all sectors, financial services through to retail. Those two, I think, have been really the victims of quite a lot of the breaches that we've seen of late, particularly around theft of data and information, but also from government through to manufacturing. We're a very practically focused organization. We produce research for our members. We produce tools, methodologies, but also we have collaborative environments that are both in-person and digital, really all focused on how we can really further information security and the protection of mission-critical information assets. Why are we looking to do that? Well, I think one of the things that we're all seeing is this information explosion, irrespective of which sector you happen to be working in, irrespective of what job you're doing. I'm not aware of anybody today, for instance, that isn't cyber-enabled in some way, shape or form. Doesn't matter whether you're delivering milk or whether you're running a large multinational. Information is really the key to everything that you do, and we're accessing that information in a range of different ways, whether it be from laptop computers through increasingly to tablets and to smartphones. And from a threat perspective, of course, that's opening up a much larger footprint and landscape. So from an information security professional standpoint, we're having to deal with the fact that information is exploding and that we're expanding the threat landscape. Threats will typically come from a number of different areas, accidental, environmental, but I think that the areas we tend to focus on the most are those that we would term adversarial. So this is typically nation-state, it's typically hacktivists, but it can also be internal. It can be journalists. So some examples, for instance, if you're looking at protecting mission-critical data, if you're manufacturing ketchup, you probably know that the recipe for the red stuff is something that you want to keep secure. If, on the other hand, you're a smartphone manufacturer and you're launching your new product, the marketing information that goes into that launch is also mission-critical in the lead-up to the launch, and of course is of great interest to a range of different adversaries that could go from being journalists through to your competitors. So the whole market landscape is changing very rapidly. Information is exploding in terms of whether we're creating it, we're storing it in a number of different areas, and that's expanding the overall threat landscape and the footprint that we need to consider when we look at how we can protect our data. And those are some of the things I think that we're going to be talking about as we go through this session, Brandon.
Well, thanks, Stephen, and thanks for sharing those few bits of information that really helps to set up our discussion today. So I'm going to pause here on the slide with everybody's headshot, title, affiliations, and so forth. And the idea here is that, as you're listening today live or in the archive, you can put a face to the voices that you're listening to and the names and sort of have a better, more immersive experience with this webcast. And I do want to remind you that this is an interactive session. We've got a really great panel here today. Let's take advantage of it. So use that question tab very liberally. Submit all the questions that you want. I will be prioritizing, and we'll try to get everything answered. So, you can even start submitting right now. So, with that said, we're going to kick off with the first question that I have, and I'm going to push this to Robert. So, Robert, how should organizations approach big data and its governance concerning sensitive queries?
Good question. One of the premises that we have about our data-centric security solutions is that organizations first need to really understand what sensitive data assets they have and where they're located. That may seem very fundamental and surprising that when you talk to organizations, a lot of them feel they have a real solid handle on that. But when you investigate further and even show them with, proof of concepts that, hey, you have data proliferation and growth going on that you're not aware of, it's very telling. And so, that's very fundamental. You can't protect what you don't understand and what you don't know that you have. So in that discovery, what are we talking about? We're not just going out and saying, hey, discover, 9-digit patterns, whatever. We're saying you need context-based policies. And what I mean by that is looking at privacy laws, looking at regulations, looking at own internal policies, looking at and then taking into account the various data domains that you have, and then wrapping them into policies that actually make sense, that this combination of data or these series of data within, a data store, a database, whatever, would constitute, a piece of sensitive information. So, an example would be, driver's license number. A driver's license number by itself is not, a sensitive piece of information. It might narrow you down to a state, but in most cases, that's about all it would do. Same thing with a Social Security number. You can publish my Social Security number all over the place as long as there's no secondary or tertiary information about it. So you have to have that context of policies. You need to be able to go across all your platforms, cloud, big data, legacy, mainframe. And then you need to be able to look at the data, chop it up, view it in a manner that is meaningful to practitioners, it's meaningful to executives, so you can have this global view or very narrow data store view of where your information is. Looking at it by department, geography, function, platform, user group. So to sum that up, basically we believe that the foundation is having that basic understanding of the data today, and some organizations are doing that, but they're doing it in a very manual kind of, ad hoc type, process, and really what they end up with is kind of a smear of, information that goes across several months of audit, maybe some discovery tools, maybe some interviews, surveys, those type of things, and that's their view of their sensitive information. So we believe that needs to be automated and on demand to set the foundation for data-centric security.
Okay, great, Robert. And so based on that, Steve, this next question is for you. So one of the things Robert said was, it's really important to know what data you have and where it's located. So how do you identify the most important data in a data-centric security approach, and sort of leveraging the answers that Robert gave, whether it's a multi-platform, it's in the cloud, it's in a Hadoop cluster, like how would you identify that data?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and we've just brought out a new piece of research that we call Protecting the Crown Jewels that really does start off by how do you go through that identification process. And it's a big challenge, Brandon, because from an information security professional standpoint, very often what we're seeing is that the InfoSec professional may not be privy to some of the most important data that an organization holds. So this is a good example where the InfoSec professional and the business need to be working hand in glove on this particular issue. Some elements of data will self-identify as being important. I mentioned earlier on about a recipe for ketchup if you happen to be in that line of business. That's pretty self-evident. But we're also seeing the need to try to secure things like board papers, not necessarily because everything that a board discusses at every meeting is important, but if your organization is going through a merger or an acquisition, then clearly some of that information will be important at that time. So we've got some time-sensitive elements of information that are coming into play here as well. And having that total perspective across the business as to what is the most important and how you can identify it is absolutely crucial. The way to do it is to collaborate very much more with the business. I think to understand the direction that the business is heading in so that you've got that overall perspective on the strategic direction. And then to begin to unpick some of the elements of information that you necessarily see flowing across the enterprise. Once you've identified it, you can then move to consider things like where is it during its information life cycle. So we need to be looking at things from creation right the way through to destruction. And over that period of time, they will, of course, be finding their way into the cloud, onto smartphones, onto tablets, and so on. And so tracking these different elements of data are absolutely crucial too in a data-centric security approach. But it's identification that's the most important element, and it's the first stage. And frankly, what we've discovered with our members is it's probably the most difficult, because it does require you to really come at it from the perspective of what is important to the business, what is the business's risk appetite, what is the business's approach to managing its information. And it takes you into areas, I think, from an information security professional standpoint that oftentimes you're not privy to. And so there's a whole range of different cultural and issues as well here that we need to get into.
Thanks, Steve. There's a word that I think you may have said, or I know that Robert said it in those contexts, and that seems to be something that's really important to a lot of this, is that data, once it's in, tends to live on forever, and it's really what other pieces can you put around it. So, along those lines, Farshad, I've got a question for you. So, given that data tends to be pretty prevalent once they're, resident, whatever the word you want to say, persistent might be the best word, once it enters into an enterprise, how do you find and identify or take that sensitive data? So you've already identified it. How do you take it and mask it from people who are not permitted to see it, while delivering it securely to those who have a business justification for seeing it?
That's a good question, Brendan, and that's one of the typical first questions we get from our customers. And we have multiple ways of addressing that. The first thing is that we tie in to the company's existing authentication services, such as the AD and LDAP and so on. So we can identify each individuals that are going to an application, and therefore the login and authentication has to be in place. But that's only the first step of the many authorization or authentication components. The authorization, which is the second level, so we authenticated, we know who you are, but we want to make sure that you're actually authorized to perform these actions. And that, of course, is dependent on where you are, within which LDAP group or individuals, can be fine-tuned. For example, you may be as part of a call center representatives that can only see the last 4 digits of a social security number. And that's quite common as you call into account verifications. Oftentimes they ask you for the last 4 digits of social. And those are not very sensitive or critical, so it can be made available to a lot of call center reps. However, they will not be able to see anything else, and everything else could be masked. And vice versa, you could do a lot of fine-tuning with the format preserving encryption and data-centric security. For example, in a case of credit cards, you can actually mask the middle 6 and leave the first 6 and last 4 in the clear, which typically shows the issuing bank and so on. So therefore, it's not a high risk item, and you can definitely perform additional analytics. So tying in all of those things happen at a place what we call management console, which is your single pane of glass around the entire data governance and policies and formats and everything else that is important for any organization. And through that management console, you can set all of those authorization permissions that I mentioned, in addition to set the formats for all the data is going in and out of different data centers. As well, you can tie in, for example, IP authorization, etc., many different ways of adding additional layers of security or a third-party plugin. Regardless, what we achieve at the end of the day is the fine-tuning of different applications or different users with different set of privileges. For example, a billing application will always have the right, for example, to gain access. And if you are going to need access to that billing application, then you have to be as part of the privileged users who is entitled and can actually log into that. And that gives you a full view of, for example, the account details. And all of those various different authorization and access can be all managed through that central place, which handles events, also shows you everything else. So you can easily assign those, and you can also monitor them through that single management console from our side.
Okay, great, thanks. So we've got a question from the audience here, and Robert, I'm going to come back to you on this one because you used specifically the word context. So the question is, how do you deal with parts of data that by themselves are not sensitive, but when you bring it together, they constitute sensitive data? So like maybe a classic example would be the rule around HIPAA, right? So having a phone number by itself or a credit card or a particular medical result by itself is not sensitive information, but when you have to identify the individual where it came from, it becomes sensitive information. Addresses become sensitive, which is very sort of silly and funny to me. But Robert, perhaps you could tackle that one for us.
Yeah, sure. This goes back to how I mentioned how you would build a policy around what is sensitive data or not. And basically that would include, a number of data domains. A lot of those, so if you think about a policy, which would include a number of data domains, it would be anchored by, something that could be combined with something else to be, sensitive or private or controlled information. So it could be a patient ID. It could be an account balance. It could be, an address or an email. So those in of themselves, are not, high risk to an organization. If you lose, a list of, 1,000, account balances and there's nothing else tied to it, who cares really? But when you start attaching names to it, then it becomes a problem. So that's why we believe that the approach to this needs to be policy-based, which is the context of the information is how it can be used with other pieces of information. So you might have a policy that defines, okay, HIPAA. It is this piece of information and that piece of information or that piece of information. So you have logic in a policy that determines, okay, here we have these specific pieces of information. Are they used together? Here is the HIPAA policy. Same thing for privacy. You could have GDPR policies. You might have PCI policies. Anything that reflects what the organization has deemed risk to itself, either by externally driven factors, or in the case of intellectual property. That could also be, a policy, whatever, the combinations the organization determines.
Okay, great. Thanks, Robert. So this next question is from the audience as well, and it's for Steve. So I'm picking you specifically, Steve. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because you're not with a vendor that's on the call right now. And the reason, you'll be very evident why I'm asking these questions. So anybody who's been in security for the last 10 years has seen an explosion in the different types of vendors, solutions, consulting firms. I mean, everything is boutique, everything is point solution. Walking the floor of RSA is a perfect example, right? They've got two sides to that hall on either side of the street open now because they had waiting lists of 40 and 50 companies deep waiting for booth space. So it's great for conferences, but it's really difficult for those of us who are trying to figure out what is the right solution when you're trying to build an enterprise security and defense sort of a posture. So, given this flood and the diversity of all these different solutions, could you give us some tips on what an enterprise could do to start to build an efficient information security practice and not just get overwhelmed by products and services and vendor diversity?
Yeah, I mean, very good questions, and certainly is something that I know a lot of organizations do struggle with, Brandon. I mean, one of the challenges with information security is that I think there absolutely is no silver bullet. There is no single product or solution or combination of them that is going to be able to solve all of the challenges that are out there. So, from my standpoint, it really is about getting a better understanding first, I think, of where you sit from an organizational standpoint with regard perhaps to compliance. If you're in a highly regulated industry, there are certain things that you're going to have to do, like it or not, in order to be compliant. And it isn't just financial services. We were just talking about HIPAA, for instance, so it's across medical as well. So I think it's about understanding how you sit within the sector that you're in and whether or not you have absolute compliance requirements, because that should be your starting point. If you're not in such a highly regulated environment, I think it's about looking at it from a risk standpoint. We all know that there is a limit on budget that's available. We all know there's a limit on resources available to work through some of these challenges. So for me, again, it's about looking at the risks. And to do that, you need to understand the risk appetite of your organization, and you need to understand your overall footprint. Where are you actually active? If you're active in some parts of the world that perhaps might give cause for concern, let's say you're a manufacturing organization and you have plants perhaps in the Far East as well as the United States, you would probably be adopting a different risk posture in the United States from the plants that you have in the Far East. And so you would want to be looking very much more closely at how you manage, say, things like your intellectual property or your manufacturing processes in the Far East than perhaps you might want to in the United States. So it's quite a complicated way of you need to look at it from quite a complex fashion from the business standpoint. But actually, it is about, I think, just pulling out of that. What are the key components that are absolutely critical to us as a business? Some good questions to ask around that are, what would be the impact if they fell into the wrong hands? What would be the impact if we weren't able to manufacture, we weren't able to operate in this particular space? Because those will start to lead you down the roads that you need to travel first in terms of making sure that you're pulling together a robust approach to security. Then when you've identified the areas that you need to be focusing on, then you can go back into the market and I think take a fairly critical view of the different products that are out there. And what I would always recommend is that you ask around as well to other organizations, perhaps in the same vertical sector as yourself, or indeed colleagues in other enterprises, to really explore how they've gone about implementing some of these solutions. Because the vendor that you talk to, with all due respect to the guys on this call and indeed other vendors who are part of our membership, they will always have the best solution. And so I think it's always useful to get some insight from the end users who've either implemented these products or indeed gone through some fairly lengthy evaluation processes themselves to just help you get a bit of a step up and understand better, I think, before you launch into going direct to some of these organizations.
Yeah, it's great. You bring up a good point of being able to, indirectly you brought this point up of really networking with your peers in the space. So, finding ways to have productive conversations with people that are in your industry, people that are outside of your industry, so that when you do have those questions, you can ask, something along the lines of like, hey, here's my situation. You guys have a similar situation. How do you tackle this problem? And, it almost leveraged the experience of those other folks as well. So thanks for that answer. I've got a fun one for you, Shad. So one of the big problems that we have had this year has been ransomware. And, especially when you look at some of the ways that this stuff gets on systems, like it's fairly low tech in a lot of cases. And I really think that it's something that is a really good problem if we can solve it. So the question is, we all have to face this ransomware problem. We all know it's here. So what would be some ways that you could address this threat, given that pretty much every single endpoint, by the way, some of those are BYOD endpoints, represent an attack vector where ransomware can be present and potentially do really bad things?
Thanks, Brandon. So yes, it has been a lot of news specifically around ransomware this year, and we have seen a great, not a great, but a big surge on that. And one of the first and most important thing is obviously you need to be having a serious backup in place as usual. Your data needs to be backed up on a regular basis. But the other issue that it points to is the fact that we do have all these sensitive data elements around at the mobile handsets inside every employee's laptop in the form of Excel spreadsheets or other ways, and in databases. So we have really increased the attack surface, and data is really exploding, and that's great for enterprise and customers, or enterprise can make meaning and sense out of it, use trends in the market using that. And so obviously the traditional encryption hasn't been able to address that. Once you encrypt everything in a strong way and put it away, the entire file or disk and so on, it's really not useful for further analytics and understanding the trends and making sense out of the data. So in essence, that has been one of the main issues with the traditional encryption, and that's why our solution in terms of having the data-centric security, and something that is truly a single unifying security solution, and it provides end-to-end encryption throughout its entire life cycle, is the way to go, and that doesn't give anybody access to live and sensitive data in its most and typical way, and only access through a set of authorized and authenticated users and applications. So that changes the landscape completely. That changes the entire access as a privilege, but data elements, the sensitive data elements, will always be maintained throughout its entire life cycle, from the point of ingestion, from the point that you gain access to that data, through its middleware that is basically performing some operation on a whole set of data, all the way into the databases that's actually written. It should always be in that format, encrypted format, but traditional encryption doesn't work too well because it really explodes the size and it breaks the format. And something like a format preserving encryption and a data-centric solution really addresses that. So you can still have your social security numbers encrypted in a way that still looks like a social security number. You can have your credit card tokenized or encrypted and still looks like a credit card, but it's not. And everything else, names, phones, and that is the default mode of any data element. Now, if you're looking at analytics, they don't care about individual credit cards, but they look at aggregate. They look at the sum of all of these things. And if you look at a breach, and we do understand that breaches do happen, and that despite all the best intentions, there's a possibility. So we don't say we actually stop the breaches, but we neutralize them, because nobody is going to gain anything of value. So if there is a ransomware, your actual data is not even visible to these hackers, and you provided a good data backup security, you can just say no, and they have nothing of value from your data sets, and you have all the control in who gains access to it. And that's an important point. And back to, I agree with Steve and yourself that there's been an explosion of security solutions out there, but typically they have been point solutions. And we feel that a data-centric solution that is really primarily aiming the data elements that are critical, and those are the high-value items. If you're targeting those and you are securing those no matter where they are, you have really addressed a bunch of those security concerns from many organizations.
Okay, great. So I've got another question from the crowd. This one is for Robert. One of the things that we face as security and technology professionals is that sometimes the problems that we're trying to solve are difficult to articulate to somebody who's not in the industry. We face this all the time, right? We face the challenges of trying to explain why it's important that we change passwords every 90 days, or why we deploy a particular encryption solution to an executive who may not really know the difference or understand why it's important. And so we have to make this case all the time. So taking that same sort of construct, and let's apply it to this problem we're talking about here. So, you've got this issue of lots of data everywhere, growing by leaps and bounds, nothing new to say here. However, when you're trying to highlight this to management, it becomes really challenging because you're trying to show the universe of the problem and you get lost in the details. So one of the suggestions or questions was, could you walk us through a way to maybe do this, maybe by starting with one particular critical data item and then walk through the end-to-end from acquisition to handoff or destruction, how that lives inside of the enterprise, including all of the offshoot points and everything else. And would that be a way to help sort of explain the magnitude of the problem just by starting with that one data item?
Well, this is $1 million question, and I wish I had a very short, succinct answer. I'm going to try the best I can to give that. Wow, I feel everybody's pain on this, and I just talked to a bank last week about basically the same issue. And one of the conclusions that we made in the discussion was that, management is very much into pain avoidance, okay? So you got to identify, the pain of, what could cause the most pain to the organization. And based on your organization, would it be, fines, embarrassment, loss of competitive edge, whatever it be, but in most cases it's going to be monetarily related, and so that requires that when you take this, let's take this first approach. Let's look at, hey, how do we demonstrate that we really need to do something here? I would suggest one thing to do would be to talk to your legal folks, talk to your privacy folks. Get a good understanding of what would really damage the organization and what is a hot button for the executive committee or the board. Okay, take a look at that from a data perspective. Okay, this would really damage our company if this information got out because of that. You could do a tracing of that information and showing them, hey, look, this information is here, it's there. Focus on one piece. This is what we would need to do to protect it. We've had these discussions with organizations before, and one of our clients, we tried this, and quite frankly, it didn't work. However, 6 months later, they were back. They had, let's just call it a financial audit, and they filled it. Now that immediately got the attention of the executive team, and they were ready to take action. And they're now a client of ours. So I think it has to be about pain avoidance, I guess, is my recommendation there. Find the thing that would be the most painful for management. What would happen if this information got out? Because we're talking in a data-centric manner here. What data would get out that would cause us the most pain as an organization? And if you can monetize that and say, yeah, this would cost us X, Y, and Z because I've done the due diligence with the privacy, the legal team, whatever. I think that's the way to approach it. But this goes into proactively starting to look at the overall risk that your organization is facing.
Okay, yeah, that's I knew there was a tough one handed to you to answer, but I like that answer, and hopefully that helps the person who asked that question. Steve, I have another one for you here, and this is maybe another $1 million question because I can't tell you how many times I've been asked a question like this, or in a consulting role. For Sean, I'm sure that your consulting folks have probably had this same conversation, or Steve, specifically people have asked you this question. It's going back to, we know the threat's there. We know that there's bad actors out there. Not everybody has a budget to be the equivalent of the Citadel or the Fort Knox or whatever particular analogy you want to use. And so we all are sort of, playing this game of, well, what does this guy do over here? I want to be as good as him, maybe a little bit better. It's the old joke of if everybody's camping and a bear runs into the camp, you don't have to be the fastest guy out. You have to be faster than the slowest guy out of the camp, right? So the question is, how secure do we really need to be? I mean, given the fact that we have all this data everywhere and things that we have today that by themselves are not sensitive, when combined can become sensitive, how do we tackle this problem? What would be some tips you could give the audience on how secure we need to be?
Yeah, and you're right, Brandon. It's one that everybody really wants the answer to. How secure do we really need to be? For me, that is a business decision. The information security professional's job, I think, in that area is to provide the counsel, to provide the advice, the guidance, if you like. But ultimately, it is a business call. And, I liked Robert's answer to the previous question where he was talking about really trying to understand pain points across the enterprise. And my answer is similar. If you're a bank, for instance, you will have determined the different levels of pain that you are prepared to go through. So, for instance, you might find acceptable that a 5-minute or 6-minute downtime on a particular application per year is acceptable. So that's the level of security you're going to put around that. You might find acceptable that you're going to, defend against 99.965% of all denial of service attacks. So that is acceptable. And so what you're starting to do then is you're building your resilience around those acceptable factors and those acceptable numbers. The same is true when we say how secure do we need to be. In a highly regulated environment, of course, then the regulator has probably already answered some of that question for you, and you're able to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to comply or not comply. If you don't comply, you know the size of the fines, and you know that what the impact of that will be. If you're not in such a highly regulated environment, then ultimately it comes down to a business call, a business decision. But I think the important thing we have to do is to go into this with our eyes open. We've alluded to different regulation and legislation that's coming about. Things like personally identifiable information, we want to be sure that is being securely protected. The fines related to that are significant. 4% of a global annual turnover clearly is a pain point for any organization, irrespective of size. And so we want to be able to make sure that we can secure that kind of information. But it also takes us outside of the realm of our own organization because the footprint is just so vast. So we have to look at our third-party providers who we're sharing that level of information with as well. And we have to verify that they're putting in place the level of security that we require and that they're fully cognizant of what our requirements might be. So how secure do we actually need to be? We need to be as secure as the business requires us to be, as the risk appetite of the business determines and of the manner in which we are able realistically to throw a security net out there over all of the different suppliers, third parties that we're working with and sharing our information with. And that, for me, really is where a data-centric approach to security really comes into its own. Because now we're not just trying to protect everything, we're trying to protect very specific elements of data that we've identified as being mission-critical assets that if they were to fall into the wrong hands would actually cause significant damage to our business and our enterprise. And so that enables us to narrow the field somewhat and focus on the elements that are absolutely most critical to what it is that we should be doing.
Thanks, Steve. All right, so this next one, since we've had $2 million questions, I've got another $1 million one for you, Prashad, and I hope that you can answer this. So I couldn't have asked for a better question to be submitted. So huge props to the person who submitted this question. We're talking a lot about structured data and protecting structured data. And we did say big data, and we did talk about cloud and other instances and things like that. But what about taking the same data-centric approach to unstructured data? So these are things that could be in PowerPoint slides or in a Word document or even in email or internal web forms, potentially. How do we take that same approach and apply it to this unstructured data?
That's a great question, Brandon, and one that we do get very frequently. Obviously, the whole world is not structured in terms of columns and rows and databases, and while quite often that is the case for the enterprise data that is massaged and managed very strictly, but it's not always the case, and we are dealing with all of the PowerPoints and Excels and so on. So one of the key products that we've had for a long time, and in fact it has been our first product, and that is our secure mail, and that's really has been dealing with the whole PKI issues and challenges around the whole certificate distribution. As you're well aware, any certificate base is truly based on a private public key pairs, and managing the sending that public key to everybody who wants to encrypt. Do they know it's coming from you? And private key is very important. If somebody gains access, can you see all my messages? And if I lose it, I can't see it. And all of those issues that typically exist with a traditional encryption was really solved by something called identity-based encryption, which really solves all of that PKI issue. So we evolved our stateless key management around that. And our stateless key management is an overlay that can be used in other encryption approaches. So we do have format preserving encryption, very specific on structured data and semi-structured. We can do certain different record types based on data row identifier, record identifiers. So there's some flexibility in there. But in addition, it could be applied on the whole file encryption. And there are a number of tools out there from Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Also, there are some discovery tools that can really truly identify the files that do contain sensitive information. And based on that, if you're taking the whole file, moving it from here, you can do it transparently, identify there's sensitive data elements, critical data elements in there, and just do the whole file encryption, similar to a secure mail. So that whole idea was born out of our secure mail product, but we have extended it to even have secure mail as well as secure file transmission as well as secure storage. And the main advantage, of course, these are using the similar traditional AES encryption, but what we do on top of it to make it easier for our customer is to have that whole stateless key management. That means just-in-time key derivation. You don't need any expensive key vaults. You don't have to deal with the whole scalability issue. And that's one of the key things we see in the age of Internet of Things and connected homes and devices, cars and everything else, all the sensor information and our very critical set of information that's being passed. And all of those endpoints need to be securing their transmission, yet traditional keys management would not be able to scale up to that. So doing the encryption is easy. It's the key management often that is the Achilles heel, and we address that, and we can extend that through discovery and then encryption of those files that contain sensitive information. And the discovery tools, as my colleagues also are attesting, Roberts and so on, they do a great job in data discovery, as well as a number of other tools out there. As I mentioned, from HPE, there's also other ones.
Okay, great. So we've got our last 10 minutes or so. We've got about 5 minutes of questions. We'll see how many we can get through here. The next question here is for Robert. So, we talked through structured data, unstructured data, dealing with this, data-centric approach. How do you really assess your sensitive data risk, and how do you, communicate that in a way that makes sense to the people who are either making policy or at least enabling you to protect this information?
Well, good timing of the question. You think about some of the comments Steve and Farshad has made about the, about various issues in the organization. What this first comes back to is what we had talked about. What is it that constitutes risk in your organization? Okay, how is the data used? In the context of actually presenting a threat. As we mentioned before, certain elements by themselves aren't really a threat. And who's using them? I mean, our natural inclination as security and privacy professionals is we want to protect everything. But you can't do that. You can't boil the ocean. So, it comes down to understanding the risk that data presents and ranking it and addressing, remediations, in a queue that the organization can assume and afford. So how do you do that? Well, first, knowing where all that data is, as we mentioned before, fundamental. Okay, got to know that. And importantly, who's using it, how they're using it, what's their typical patterns, and then what data is being shared, because that's really sometimes an unknown. Structured, unstructured, whatever type of data being created, but then how is it shared downstream? Is it, leapfrogging from one place to another, and you're really not aware of that, and you don't have the controls in all those downstream hops to protect the data. The regulations, policies that apply to it, internal policies, that is, goes back to, how you set up your actual data policies. Its value to the organization, that can be very subjective, but you can at least put together, a anecdotal scale, not based on any actuaries or anything, but, with the help of legal, privacy folks, that says, this type of data would represent, this much value to the organization. This other, might be very, very sensitive and represents this type of risk to the organization. How it's being protected today, maybe it's just encrypted and, that's enough. Maybe you need encryption, access, database access controls. Maybe you need field-preserving encryption. Maybe you need masking, to combine all of those. And then you look at, how much of this data do we have? How many people access it? So all these combine and can be tailored to go, this represents how we define risk, and when you have the location of all the data, then you can start looking at it from a risk perspective, and you can, do heat maps, you can do a number of different things to provide to people to say, hey, our biggest issue is our data center in London. It has, this much risk and it's this much value to the organization. So that's how one approach to assessing risk in a data-centric, approach would work.
All right, great. Thanks for that. So probably the last question here, Steve, I'm going to send it to you. If you could try to give me a 2-minute answer, that'd be great. So what are just give me like 1 or 2 major threats to be aware of in a data-centric approach to security?
It's for me, it's people, good guys and bad guys. So the bad guys, the cyber criminals, they're interested in trying to get a hold of it because it has a value, and the good guys, because not everybody stuffs up intentionally. We have things like people who make mistakes, negligence, accidental loss of information. So I think that the way in which an organization goes about dealing with that it isn't just about technology, it isn't just about processes, it's also a massive focus on people and on awareness. But for me, it's a people thing.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Steve. So we're at about 55 minutes past, so we're going to wrap this discussion up. What I'd like to do is ask each panelist for one takeaway recommendation and any closing remarks they have to share with the listeners while we're closing this talk out. So let's start with Steve. Since I finished that last question with you, let's just start with you, and we'll go back down the way here.
Yeah, I think for me, a data-centric approach really is the top one here. It's about working with the business because, information security can only go so far, but ultimately the business has to assess the degree of risk it's prepared to take with regard to its information and the way that it manages it. And that's about identifying roles and responsibilities within the business, and it's about identifying who you can work with from an information security or privacy or risk standpoint as well. And that requires you, I think, to slightly change the way in which you view data, the way in which you view protecting it, and it will take you into areas that perhaps you hadn't really imagined when you start to go down this data-centric route that we've been talking about for the last hour or so.
All right, great. Thanks, Steve. Next, Robert, one takeaway and any closing remarks.
Well, takeaways would be, understand what you have. That's very important. If you got to have that foundation of understanding what you have, and then the understanding of what you have and its risk. Okay, I think from there, a lot of decisions, informed, intelligent decisions, can be made. About what is important to the organization, where they need to invest. Where do they need to spend resources, and what they would do is, they might figure out, okay, how are we going to monitor this data? Who's using it? How's it moving? Those type of things. What controls would we need to have remediation for?
Okay, great. Thanks, Robert. And last but not least, Farshad, can you give us one takeaway, please?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously, as I mentioned throughout while answering to some of the questions, make sure that your data by default is protected. That is the most important part. As the data is coming in, you need to be replacing it with a surrogate value, and throughout its entire life cycle, keep it in a protected format. That really reduces any exposure. So if there's a breach, bad actors will not get away with important stuff. But also make sure it's standard-based, so it's vetted by industry experts, cryptographers, mathematicians, as well as the scalability, which is really required, and we achieve that through, for example, stateless architecture. But you need to be addressing the explosion of the data, and it's doubling every year and so on, so traditional methods do not really address that. So it's important to make sure that you're ready and scalable for the explosion of data that's coming your way, otherwise you'll be choked with all that data. And it's also backed by customer testimonials and direct one-on-one reference customers. You need to be doing that from organizations and enterprises. It's always hard to figure out what is the right thing. Just make sure you talk to every vendor's customers one-on-one without anybody else present, and make sure you get the direct information from people who have experienced those set of products.
Awesome. Steve, Robert, Farshad, thank you for your time today. It's been great. A lot of great content on this webcast, and thank you again for lending your opinions. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly.
Okay. Thanks again for a great discussion, everyone, and thank you to our attendees for your questions. If we did not get to your question, we will respond by email. And please take a moment to leave us a rating and share any feedback you may have. Be sure to scroll down to submit via your console. We value feedback, and we take it into consideration when we are planning those future events. I want to remind those listening as well to check out the attached resources through the Attachments tab, and if you'd like additional information related to today's topic, please visit www.executiveitforums.org, where you can access our resources for free. So that's just about it for today. Please join us again on October 18th at 1 p.m. Eastern for IT Security and Privacy Governance in the Cloud with the Privacy Professor, Rebecca Harold, and you can confirm your position through your console at the end. I'd like to thank all of today's speakers for joining us, with a special thanks to our sponsors, HPE Security Data Security and Informatica, without whom these events would not be possible. And of course, thank you to our attendees for listening. Please stay tuned for our next event, and have a great day, everyone.